At 8:43 in the morning on July 2nd, 1937, a woman's voice cut through radio static in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. The signal was weak. The transmission lasted less than a minute. And then, nothing. Somewhere in a stretch of open ocean the size of Texas, the most famous female pilot in the world had vanished, along with her navigator, her plane, and any physical trace of what happened next. The official story is the one you already know. Amelia Earhart ran out of fuel somewhere near Howland Island, crashed into the Pacific, and sank 2 miles down with her aircraft. Case closed. Tragic, simple, except almost nothing about that version of events actually holds up under closer inspection. And the alternative, the one that a small group of researchers has been quietly building for over 30 years, the one that keeps refusing to die even when the mainstream press ignores it, is a story that would make anyone comfortable with the official version deeply uncomfortable. Because if the alternative theory is right, Amelia Earhart didn't die when her plane hit the water. She landed. She survived for days, maybe weeks, on a coral reef in the middle of nowhere. She sent radio distress calls that dozens of people around the Pacific heard and reported. And she died alone on an island the United States Navy searched from the air 7 days after her disappearance and somehow declared uninhabited. Right now, as this video is being made, a research team is on that island looking for the evidence that would settle the question forever. And the story of how we got here, of what the evidence has been telling us for almost 90 years, and why nobody wanted to hear it, is stranger than the tidy ocean crash you probably learned in school. To understand why the Castaway theory refused to die, you have to start with who Amelia Earhart actually was. Because the version most people carry in their head is a portrait of a legend, not a person, and the person is considerably more interesting than the legend. She was born in Atchison, Kansas in 1897 to a family that was slowly falling apart around her. Her father was a railroad lawyer with a drinking problem that would eventually cost him his career. Her mother came from money and married down and never quite forgave anyone in the family for the fact. The Earhart household moved constantly, Iowa, Missouri, Minnesota, Illinois, chasing whatever job her father could still hold. By the time Amelia was a teenager, she had attended 6 different high schools and learned in a way most people never have to, that stability was something you built for yourself or did not get at all. Her first exposure to airplanes came at a state fair in Toronto during World War I, when she was working as a nurse's aide at a military hospital. She watched a pilot deliberately buzz a crowd she was standing in, a stunt meant to scare people, and it did scare most of them, and she reportedly stood absolutely still while everyone around her scattered. Something in that moment locked into place. She would later describe the sound of the engine passing overhead as a specific kind of calling, the way people describe religious conversion. It took her another 5 years to get into a cockpit. In 1921, at 23, she paid $10 for her first flying lesson at an airfield outside Los Angeles. Her instructor was a female pilot named Anita Snook, one of a handful of women flying professionally in the United States at that point. Earhart sold her horse and worked jobs as a photographer, a truck driver, and a telephone company clerk to save up for lessons. Within a year, she had bought her own plane, a used Kinner Airster, painted bright yellow, which she named the Canary. She was not, by any technical measure, an extraordinary pilot in those early years. Contemporaries and later biographers agree on this point. Her flying was competent, sometimes careless, occasionally reckless. She crashed the Canary twice. What she had that most pilots of her era did not was something else entirely. An instinct for publicity, a photogenic face, and an unusual willingness to say yes to opportunities that other, more experienced aviators considered too dangerous. In 1928, she said yes to something specifically because she knew it would make her famous. A wealthy American named Amy Guest had planned to be the first woman to cross the Atlantic by plane. Her family found out and forbade it. Guest, refusing to abandon the project entirely, agreed to fund it if a suitable substitute could be found, a woman who would be photographed as the passenger while male pilots actually did the flying. Amelia Earhart was chosen for the role. She rode across the Atlantic in a plane called the Friendship, sitting in the back, contributing nothing to the actual navigation or piloting, and became internationally famous the moment she stepped onto Welsh soil. She was honest about what had happened. She told reporters directly that she had been, in her own words, just baggage, like a sack of potatoes. She said the two men who flew the plane deserved all the credit. The public didn't care. Photographs of her in her leather flying jacket, tall and thin and windswept, ran in every newspaper in America. She was, effectively overnight, one of the most recognizable women in the world. What she did with that fame is what separates her story from every other lucky celebrity of the era. She used it to become the pilot the public already believed she was. Over the next 9 years, she set record after record. First woman to fly solo across the Atlantic in 1932, first person of either sex to fly solo from Hawaii to California in 1935, first woman to fly nonstop across the United States, first person to fly solo from Mexico City to New Jersey. Each flight was riskier than the last. Each was carefully timed for maximum media attention. Each earned her more money, more sponsorship deals, and more public expectation of what she would attempt next. By 1937, she was 40 years old, a considerable age for a pilot in the era when most died young, and she had one flight left in her that mattered. A circumnavigation of the globe, taking the longest possible route closer to the equator than anyone had ever attempted. The kind of flight that would either define her permanently or kill her. It did both. The plane she chose for the world flight was a Lockheed Model 10 Electra, a twin-engine, all-metal aircraft that Purdue University had helped her purchase in 1936 for the specific purpose of what she called her flying laboratory. It was one of the most advanced civilian planes of the era, capable of carrying enough fuel for the longest legs of the trip, sophisticated enough to handle the navigational challenges of open ocean flight, and rugged enough, in theory, to survive whatever the Pacific decided to throw at it. For a navigator, she chose a man named Fred Noonan. Noonan was one of the most experienced Pacific navigators alive at the time. He had spent years working for Pan American Airways, plotting the routes for the massive Clipper flying boats that had opened up commercial trans-Pacific aviation just a few years earlier. He knew the ocean below them in a way almost no one else did. He also, according to persistent reports from people who knew him, had a drinking problem that had cost him his Pan Am job. Whether that problem was under control by the summer of 1937 has been debated by historians ever since. They took off from Miami on June 1st, heading east. Over the next 4 weeks, they crossed the Caribbean, South America, the Atlantic, Africa, the Middle East, South Asia, and Southeast Asia, landing in cities most Americans in 1937 could not have found on a map, refueling, sleeping briefly, taking off again. By the time they reached Lae, in what was then New Guinea, on June 29th, they had covered roughly 22,000 miles. Only 7,000 miles remained, almost all of it over open Pacific water. The next leg was the one that mattered most, and it was the one everyone involved in the flight knew was the most dangerous. 2,500 miles of open ocean from Lae to a target that stretched, at its widest point, less than 2 miles across, Howland Island. Howland is a coral speck almost exactly halfway between Australia and Hawaii. It rises less than 20 feet above sea level at its highest point. It has no natural harbor, no permanent population, no vegetation taller than scattered coconut palms. The United States government had specifically constructed an airstrip on Howland in the months leading up to Earhart's flight, a runway built into a sandbar in the middle of nowhere, existing for essentially no purpose other than to give her a place to land. A Coast Guard ship called the Itasca had been stationed offshore to guide her in by radio. Finding it from a plane after 20 hours of flight in an era before satellite navigation existed was going to require Noonan to plot their course by dead reckoning and celestial observation with almost no margin for error. If they were off by even 1 degree, the width of your thumb held at arm's length, they would miss the island entirely and fly into open ocean with no way of knowing which direction to correct toward. They took off from Lae at 10 in the morning on July 2nd, 1937 local time. The plane was heavy with fuel, approximately 1,100 gallons, enough for roughly 24 hours of flight in ideal conditions, which meant that from the moment their wheels left the runway, they had less than a day to find an island the size of a small airport, in the middle of an ocean, using instruments that would have looked primitive to any modern pilot. For the first several hours, everything went according to plan. Earhart made periodic radio transmissions on schedule. Noonan reportedly took celestial fixes at regular intervals. Weather over the Western Pacific was reasonable. Then, as they approached the general area where Howland should have been, something started going wrong with their communications. They could transmit. Multiple radio operators across the Pacific heard fragments of Earhart's voice throughout the last hours of the flight, but they were not receiving. Every attempt by the Itasca to reach them, to give them bearings, to guide them toward the island, none of it seemed to be getting through. Whether this was equipment failure, atmospheric interference, or Earhart's own unfamiliarity with the specific radio configuration she was using has been argued for 89 years without resolution. What is not in dispute is the timeline of what the world heard from her in those final hours. And that timeline is where the tidy official story starts to fall apart, because Amelia Earhart's voice was heard, clearly and repeatedly, for far longer than a woman who had crashed into the Pacific Ocean should have been able to transmit. The last radio transmission the Coast Guard Itasca definitively received from Amelia Earhart came at 8:43 in the morning, local time on July 2, 1937. She was, by her own report, running on fuel reserves. She could not see Howland Island. She could not hear the Itasca's response signals. Her voice, according to the operators who heard it, was tense in a way that had not been present in earlier transmissions, but not panicked. She reported that she was flying on the line 157337, a navigational reference to the sun's position that Fred Noonan would have plotted moments earlier. Then the signal cut out. Under the official version of events, the one printed in textbooks, referenced in documentaries, and repeated in every casual retelling of Amelia Earhart's disappearance for almost 90 years. This is where her story ends. She ran out of fuel within minutes of that final transmission, ditched into the open Pacific, and sank beneath thousands of feet of water that no search team of the 1930s could have possibly reached. Case closed. The problem with that version is that it doesn't account for what happened next. Over the following 6 days, radio operators across the Pacific, amateur enthusiasts sitting in living rooms in California, professional stations in Hawaii, ship crews scattered across thousands of miles of ocean, began reporting weak, fragmentary transmissions on the same frequencies Earhart had been using. Some were dismissed at the time as hoaxes. Some were dismissed as interference. Some were dismissed simply because the people receiving them were not credentialed enough to be taken seriously. But the pattern of what those operators reported, collected, cataloged, and analyzed in exhaustive detail decades later by researchers at an organization called the International Group for Historic Aircraft Recovery, or TIGAR, is not the kind of pattern you get from random noise or attention-seeking hoaxers. Multiple operators in multiple locations at times that lined up with the tidal cycles of a specific stretch of ocean reported hearing a woman's voice. Some reported her identifying herself directly. Some reported hearing her ask for help. At least one, a 15-year-old girl named Betty Klink in St. Petersburg, Florida, wrote down what she heard in a notebook that survived in her family's possession for over 60 years before it became public. The transcripts included what appeared to be one-sided conversations, references to injury, references to a companion, Noonan, who was described as behaving erratically. Here's the detail that mattered most to the researchers who later re-examined these transmissions. A plane that has crashed into deep ocean cannot transmit anything. The radios in the Lockheed Electra required the plane's engines to be running in order to generate the electrical power the transmitters needed. If Earhart's plane had ditched into the Pacific on July 2nd, every one of those subsequent transmissions is impossible. There is no scenario in which a submerged aircraft sitting on the ocean floor sends radio signals for 6 more days, which means one of two things has to be true. Either every single one of those post-disappearance transmissions was a hoax or hallucination, which the sheer number of independent operators reporting them makes statistically almost impossible, or Amelia Earhart's plane did not sink into the ocean on July 2, 1937, and if it didn't sink, it had to have landed somewhere. 400 miles southeast of Howland Island, in what was then part of the British Phoenix Islands Protectorate, sat a coral atoll called Gardner Island, uninhabited, uninteresting to almost anyone in the world in the summer of 1937. Roughly the shape of a comma, about 4 miles long, with a shallow lagoon in the middle and a reef flat exposed at low tide that ran along its western edge. That reef flat, it turned out, was long enough, flat enough, and hard enough at low tide to serve as an improvised landing strip for a Lockheed Electra, just barely. A skilled pilot running on empty and out of options would have had exactly one chance to bring a plane down on it without cartwheeling into the surf. Someone did. The evidence for this, and it is genuinely substantial, accumulated over decades of investigation, begins with the search that took place 7 days after Earhart's disappearance. On July 9, 1937, a Navy pilot named John Lambrecht flew a low-altitude reconnaissance pass over Gardner Island as part of the massive search operation Franklin Roosevelt had ordered for the missing aviator. His flight report, filed the same day, described the island as showing signs of recent habitation, a phrase military reconnaissance officers do not use casually, and one that referred to what looked like recently disturbed vegetation, and what Lambrecht believed might be signs of human presence on the reef. He did not land. He did not investigate further. The search moved on. 3 years later, on that same island, someone found bones. In 1940, a British colonial administrator named Gerald Gallagher arrived on what was still called Gardner Island as part of a small settlement program that would attempt, briefly and unsuccessfully, to make the atoll productive for the British Empire. During his time there, laborers clearing brush on the southeastern end of the island came across a partial human skeleton lying in a clearing beneath a wren tree, a species of tropical hardwood common to the region. The remains were incomplete. Weather, animals, and time had done their work over what appeared to be several years. But there was enough to work with. A skull, a partial pelvis, long bones from arms and legs, and arranged nearby, in a way that suggested the person had been living there rather than simply crashing and dying, several deliberate objects. A sextant box of a type used for celestial navigation, the remains of a pair of women's shoes, a small bottle of Benedictine liqueur. Gallagher, who apparently understood immediately what he might be looking at, packaged the bones and the artifacts and shipped them to Fiji for examination by British colonial medical authorities. In his own correspondence at the time, which survived in colonial archives and became public decades later, he explicitly speculated that he might have found Amelia Earhart. He asked in writing for the analysis to be handled carefully and for the possibility to be seriously considered. It wasn't. The bones were examined in 1941 by a colonial doctor named David Hoodless, working at the Central Medical School in Fiji. Hoodless measured what he had, a limited set of long bones and skull fragments without any of the modern forensic tools that would exist within decades, and concluded that the remains belonged to a short, stocky, middle-aged man. Not Amelia Earhart. Case closed. The bones were then, according to the paperwork that survives, lost. Nobody has been able to locate them since. What existed instead was Hoodless's measurements, written down in a British colonial medical file, and eventually forgotten in a Fijian archive for almost 50 years. In 1998, Tihar researchers found the file, and in 2018, an American forensic anthropologist named Richard Jantz, using modern osteometric analysis techniques that hadn't existed in Hoodless's time, ran the measurements through a database of thousands of documented human skeletons of known origin. The results contradicted the 1941 conclusion in almost every measurable way. Jantz's analysis, published in the journal Forensic Anthropology, concluded that the bone measurements were more similar to Earhart than to 99% of individuals in a large reference sample. The remains, according to modern forensic standards, were consistent with a tall, thin, European-American woman of approximately Earhart's age and build. The 1941 examination had been wrong. Almost 80 years wrong. By itself, the Yance analysis is not proof. He was working from measurements taken by another doctor of bones nobody can find. Multiple sources of error are possible. But the analysis does something the official ocean crash story cannot. It explains why an experienced colonial administrator, standing on a Pacific atoll in 1940, took one look at what his workers had found and immediately thought of the most famous missing aviator in the world. The Yance analysis is not the only piece of evidence that has emerged from Gardner Island, now known by its modern name, Nikumaroro. Over the past 30 years, expeditions organized by Tiger and other groups have recovered a growing list of artifacts from the island that, individually, prove nothing, but collectively describe a picture that becomes progressively harder to dismiss. Fragments of aluminum sheeting consistent with 1930s aircraft manufacturing techniques. A small glass jar that once contained a specific brand of freckle cream Amelia Earhart is known to have used. Pieces of a shoe heel matching the style and size of shoes she was photographed wearing in the last known images of her before takeoff. Bone fragments that dogs trained to detect human remains alerted to during a 2017 expedition. A woman's compact mirror. Zipper pulls of the type used on American-made clothing of the 1930s. Fragments of a specific kind of American-made pocket knife. None of these items, by themselves, would prove anything. All of them together, on an uninhabited Pacific atoll 400 miles from where Amelia Earhart officially disappeared, describe a picture that gets harder to explain away with every new find. But the physical artifacts, as compelling as they are not the strongest piece of evidence for what happened on Nikumaroro. That distinction belongs to something considerably more recent, and it comes from a technology that didn't exist during any previous search. Satellites looking down at the island's lagoon from space. In 2015, a researcher named Rick Pettigrew, executive director of a nonprofit called the Archaeological Legacy Institute, was reviewing satellite imagery of Nikumaroro Island when he noticed something in the lagoon that didn't belong there. A dark, elongated shape partially buried in the sediment of the shallow water, sitting close to the island's western shore near a feature called the Taraya Inlet. The shape had specific characteristics that caught his attention. It was roughly 12 to 14 meters long, almost exactly the length of a Lockheed Model 10 Electra fuselage, which measured 12.2 meters from nose to tail. It appeared to have proportions and geometry consistent with a partially collapsed aircraft frame. And most importantly, it was in a place no natural rock formation should be, sitting on the flat sandy floor of a shallow tropical lagoon, in a shape and size that fit nothing that belonged in the environment. Pettigrew began working backward through the historical satellite record. What he found made the anomaly harder, not easier to dismiss. The object appeared in satellite imagery from 2009. It appeared in imagery from 2015. It appeared in imagery from 2020, 2022, 2024. Across 15 years of imaging by different satellites operated by different organizations, the same shape kept appearing in the same location. Sometimes clearer, sometimes partially covered by shifting lagoon sand, but always there. Natural formations shift over 15 years. Rock formations in shallow tropical lagoons erode, get colonized by coral, change shape as sediment moves. This object had not. It had the persistence of a manufactured structure, not a geological feature. And it sat in a position exactly where the Castaway theory predicted a plane might have ended up if it had been landed on the Western Reef Flat, and then, over subsequent weeks or months, been pushed by tidal action into the deeper water of the lagoon. Pettigrew called it the Taraya object. The Archaeological Legacy Institute began working with Purdue University, the same university that had helped Earhart purchase her Electra almost 90 years earlier, to organize an expedition to investigate the object directly. The plan was straightforward. Take a research team by sea to Nikumaroro. Deploy drones to map the site from the air. Send divers into the lagoon with sonar, underwater cameras, and metal detectors. Determine, once and for all, whether the object was aircraft debris or something else. The expedition was originally planned for November 2025. It was delayed to 2026 because of permit clearance issues with the government of Kiribati, the Pacific nation that now administers Nikumaroro, and because the South Pacific cyclone season made the original timing impossible. On July 28, 2026, one day short of the 89th anniversary of Amelia Earhart's official disappearance, the expedition departed from Majuro in the Marshall Islands, sailing 1,200 nautical miles across open ocean toward the atoll. The team was scheduled to spend approximately 5 days on and around Nikumaroro, focused specifically on the Taraya object and the surrounding lagoon. At the time this video is being produced, that expedition is either underway or has recently concluded. The results, whatever they turn out to be, will not have been fully processed or announced yet. Whether the object in the lagoon turns out to be the remains of a Lockheed Electra or a curiously plane-shaped rock formation that has been fooling satellite analysts for 15 years will be one of the more significant answers in the entire history of aviation. The satellite anomaly is not the only piece of recent developments. In September of 2025, following a presidential directive to declassify government records related to the Earhart disappearance, the National Archives created a dedicated release page for the documents. Between November of 2025 and January of 2026, 4 separate tranches of previously classified files were made public, totaling 10,155 pages. The contents of those files are still being analyzed by researchers. Early reviews suggest most of the material consists of Navy and State Department correspondence about the initial search operations, decades-old memos evaluating various theories, and previously restricted photographs from the 1937 recovery effort. Whether anything in those 10,155 pages contains a genuinely new piece of information, something that would confirm or refute the Castaway theory directly, remains an open question that researchers will be working through for years to come. But the fact that those files were classified at all for almost 90 years is itself worth sitting with. Whatever the government knew or suspected about what happened to Amelia Earhart on July 2, 1937, it apparently believed the information was sensitive enough to keep locked up for the better part of a century. That is not the behavior of an agency that believes the answer is a simple ocean crash with no complications. Which brings us finally to the question the Castaway theory has always circled back to. If Amelia Earhart landed on Nikumaroro, if she survived, sent radio calls for days, and was ultimately abandoned, how does that actually happen? How does a Navy search operation ordered directly by the President of the United States fly directly over the island where she was and somehow miss her? Before we go any further, I want to take a moment and then get right back into it. If you've stayed with this video through the radio transmissions, the Fiji medical file, the Taraya object, and the 10,155 pages of files a government kept classified for almost 90 years, you're the kind of person who wants a story built on what the evidence actually shows, not what the tidy version of history prefers to remember. That's exactly what this channel exists to make, and we put out videos like this one every single day. Subscribing costs nothing, and it means the next one just shows up. Now back to July 9th, 1937, and the moment that should have ended the mystery before it began. 7 days after Amelia Earhart's disappearance, Franklin Roosevelt's administration had ordered the largest peacetime search operation the United States Navy had ever conducted. 9 ships and 66 aircraft spread across a search zone covering approximately 250,000 square miles of the Central Pacific Ocean. The battleship USS Colorado had been rerouted from Honolulu specifically for the search. The aircraft carrier USS Lexington had been repositioned from San Diego, bringing 60 of its own planes into the operation. Among the ships involved was a smaller vessel, the USS Colorado's float plane detachment, which was tasked with conducting low-altitude reconnaissance passes over the Phoenix Islands, the same island group that contained what was then called Gardner Island. On July 9th, Navy pilot John Lambrecht flew directly over Gardner Island as part of that reconnaissance sweep. His report, filed after the flight, contains a phrase that has haunted this story ever since. He described Gardner Island as showing signs of recent habitation, vegetation that appeared to have been disturbed, features that suggested human activity in a place that was officially uninhabited. He also reported seeing nothing that positively identified the presence of survivors or an aircraft. He did not land. The reasoning at the time was straightforward. Gardner Island was in the Phoenix Islands group, hundreds of miles from Howland Island, in an area the Navy had already dismissed as unlikely for Earhart to have reached. Lambrecht's Pass was a routine reconnaissance sweep meant to rule out possibilities, not investigate them. He observed the island from the air, saw nothing that seemed to demand immediate action, and moved on to the next search area. Here is what the Castaway theory has always argued about that decision. If Amelia Earhart had landed on the reef flat at Gardner Island on July 2nd, as multiple lines of evidence now suggest she might have, her plane would have been sitting in shallow water at low tide during the days after the crash. Between the crash landing and July 9th, when Lambrecht flew over, roughly 7 days of tidal cycles would have passed. Each high tide would have lifted the aircraft slightly. Each low tide would have set it down again. Wave action against the reef would have gradually pushed the plane closer to the surf line, potentially breaking pieces off, and eventually, this is the argument, would have submerged the fuselage or dragged it into the deeper water of the lagoon. By July 9th, 7 days later, the plane might have been almost entirely underwater. What Lambrecht was seeing from the air, if this timeline is right, was not an empty island. It was an island whose most obvious piece of evidence had been eaten by the ocean in exactly the number of days between the crash and the search. The signs of recent habitation, he reported, the disturbed vegetation, the features that caught his eye enough to note them in his official report, those may have been Earhart and Noonan themselves, or the traces they left, on an island small enough that a low-altitude pass by a float plane should have found them if the pilot had known what he was looking for. He didn't land. Nobody landed. And by the time anyone returned to Gardner Island, 3 years later when the British began their colonial settlement attempt, whatever human presence had been there was reduced to bones under a tree and a scattering of objects nobody at the time thought to connect to the most famous missing person in the world. None of this proves the Castaway theory. It's possible Lambrecht saw exactly what he thought he saw, an uninhabited coral atoll with nothing unusual happening on it. It's possible the signs of recent habitation referred to something entirely unrelated to Earhart. It's possible every piece of physical evidence recovered from Nikumaroro over the past 30 years is a coincidence or a misidentification or a hoax. But it is also possible, and this is what makes the story genuinely difficult to walk away from, that the entire mystery of what happened to Amelia Earhart was actually solvable in July of 1937. That a Navy pilot flew directly over the answer, filed a report saying so, and was believed by nobody in a position to act on it. And that, for 89 years, everyone who has believed the ocean crash story has been believing something the government's own reconnaissance data had already contradicted before anyone knew there was a mystery to solve. So here's where all of this actually leaves you. You came into this video with an image of Amelia Earhart that most people carry, a legendary aviator who flew into open ocean, ran out of fuel, and vanished beneath waves that were too deep and too vast to ever give her back. A tragic accident, a story with no villains and no answers, filed under the general category of mysteries the world doesn't get to solve. You now know that version of events was decided, essentially, within a few days of her disappearance. Not because the evidence supported it, because it was the version that required the least follow-up. A plane sunk 2 miles down an open ocean is a story you close the file on. A woman surviving alone on a coral atoll, sending radio distress calls that nobody in a position of authority took seriously, is a story that raises considerably harder questions about who was listening, who wasn't, and why. You know that a Navy pilot flew over the island she was probably on 7 days after her disappearance and reported seeing signs of recent habitation. He didn't land. You know that 3 years later, someone found bones under a tree on that same island, along with a sextant box and a woman's shoes. You know a colonial doctor examined those bones in 1941 and got the analysis wrong, and that a modern forensic anthropologist rechecked his numbers in 2018 and found that the remains were consistent with Amelia Earhart's exact build, in ways that would be difficult to explain by coincidence. You know that satellite imagery has been showing an aircraft-sized object in the lagoon of that same island for at least 15 years. You know a research expedition is investigating that object right now, as this video reaches you. You know that 10,000 pages of government files about her disappearance were kept classified for the better part of a century and were only released within the last few months. None of that, taken individually, is proof of anything. All of it, taken together, describes something that has been quietly sitting in the archives, in the reef sand, in the satellite imagery, and in the notebooks of a 15-year-old girl in Florida who heard something she wasn't supposed to be able to hear. For 89 years, waiting for anyone to bother assembling the pieces into a shape that resembles the truth. Here's the part worth carrying with you longest, though, because it applies to more than just this one story. The mystery of what happened to Amelia Earhart has never really been an unsolvable mystery. It has been an inconvenient one. Every generation that has looked at the evidence, the 1937 Navy search that missed her, the 1940 discovery that was dismissed as a stocky middle-aged man, the 1998 rediscovery of the file that had been forgotten for 60 years, the 2018 reanalysis, the 2026 expedition. Every single one of those moments has been an opportunity to find the answer, and every single one has required somebody to go actively looking for it. Mysteries don't stay mysteries because the universe is hiding something. They stay mysteries because the people who could solve them decide it's easier not to. Because the version everybody already believes is comfortable enough. Because the alternative involves admitting that a search was botched, a diagnosis was wrong, a report was ignored. The Castaway theory of Amelia Earhart's disappearance is not the version anyone wanted to believe. It requires the United States Navy to have missed something obvious. It requires the British colonial administration to have thrown away the answer in a poorly stored medical file. It requires almost every decade between 1937 and now to have contained at least one moment where somebody could have said, "Wait, what if we've been wrong the whole time?" and didn't. Amelia Earhart may still be waiting on that island, not in some cosmic or symbolic sense. Physically, in pieces of aircraft aluminum in a lagoon, in bone fragments the coconut crabs didn't finish carrying off, in artifacts the tide hasn't yet erased. She may be about to be found 90 years after her voice first cut through the radio static by people who finally decided to look in the place her own evidence had been quietly pointing to the entire time. Or she may not. The Taraya object may turn out to be a rock. The expedition may return with nothing conclusive. The mystery may continue for another generation, waiting for the next team, the next technology, the next moment when somebody decides to check what the last team missed. Either way, the story of Amelia Earhart is no longer the tidy tragedy the school books made it out to be. It is a much stranger, much more human story about how the world decides which questions to leave unanswered, and for how long. If you made it this far, you already know this isn't the kind of channel that's going anywhere. We put out something like this every single day, the version of the story that survives contact with the actual evidence. Subscribing keeps you in that loop. And if this one stayed with you, send it to 5 people who'd sit through something this long with you. Not everyone will. Some people do. Leave a comment, a real one. Tell me what part of this actually surprised you. And tell me what mystery, what forgotten person, what quiet disappearance you want us to look at next. We'll be here tomorrow, still digging.